Very much, and thank you for the many replies. Mr. Bruni and I have the responsibility of pointing out where we didn't get replies, so you'll forgive me if I don't repeat some of the positive information we received and focus on the things we didn't seem to receive. As an overarching concern, I wanted to say that we heard a lot about the laws. We appreciate that, and we always, as a committee, look at these issues very carefully. We heard a lot about procedures, and that's also very important. And we asked a lot of questions about those, too, in fairness. We set that up in some ways. But what we didn't seem to hear, what I didn't seem to hear, was about the substantive allegations that were raised, cases, except for the ACF and Prageeth and the Trinco. I didn't hear about substantive allegations that we presented and asked about. I didn't hear much about abuses, but I also didn't hear much about the issue of impunity and how you're tackling it. And from everything we've heard in this review, from NGOs, from your National Human Rights Commission, and frankly in our discussion, your presentations yesterday, responses today, the issue of impunity seems to be hanging like a sword over the entire situation in your country, and frankly over our review. So I would really welcome it if you could address that clearly in the time you have remaining, and I know you want to get to the UN peacekeepers, and I asked that question again, so I do want to hear about that, and the protection of migrants. But let's see if we can get to some of the other things that weren't addressed. In the response, I understood that in the questions that were raised, for example, about the welfare centers, I raised questions about that yesterday, and I asked specifically about Manic Farm Camp and a number of other related things. And the answer I think I heard was that it's going to be addressed by new mechanisms that are going to be created in response to the resolution, the HRC resolution, and that the task force is going to submit recommendations this week and so forth and so on. Well, I asked some other very specific questions. I asked about Manic Farm, and I asked about the allegations of torture and ill treatment that took place in the aftermath of the conflict with allegedly of camp residents, and that allegedly by the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, and the TID, the Terrorist Investigation Department. This was part of our review in 2011, and it seems to have been overlooked. And I specifically asked for information from any member of the delegation, but I addressed my comments to one member of the delegation, Mr. Cicera Mendes, who was with us yesterday and today, but who hasn't spoken. Now, Mr. Mendes, I said you were, as far as I knew, responsible for supervising the work of the CID and TID during the immediate aftermath of the conflict when you were serving as Deputy Inspector General of the Police. And I specifically asked you yesterday, the web is now up, by the way, for anybody who's looking for yesterday's review, it's now up on the web. On the UN website, webtv.un.org. I asked if you could share any information with us about the conduct of interrogations that took place at Manic Farm and at Vivunia Hospital. I cited the information from the Secretary General's panel of experts about cases of torture perpetrated by CID and TID during the interrogations at both locations. I asked about time. I asked about supervisory efforts. I asked if you were physically present at these locations in May and June, and what steps were taken there. And I haven't heard any response about that. Since yesterday, the internet seems to have exploded. And Reporters Without Borders, Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka, the International Truth and Justice Project, and others have been writing about you, Mr. Mendes. And they say that you indeed oversaw the CID and TID. And in fact, I don't need them to tell me that because I have the High Commissioner's Office's report, the OISL report, which in paragraph 134 says that the CID is primarily responsible for investigating services and organized crimes, but also counterterrorism activities, and it talks about the so-called fourth floor at police headquarters in Colombo, which it says, and I quote, is particularly notorious as a place where many detainees are taken for interrogation. And then it says, in April 2009, the Deputy Inspector General of the CID was Jayasuriya Mendes, unquote. In paragraph 553 of the OISL report, it tells us that the commonly used centers, such as the Joseph Military Camp in Vivunia and the CID fourth floor in Colombo, quote, had rooms that were set up with torture equipment, illustrating the premeditated and systematic nature of the use of torture by units of the Sri Lankan security forces, unquote. And then they describe some of that equipment in detail, and it's quite arresting, quite grim. So, Mr. Mendes, it's very unusual for this committee to have a person who's had the experiences you have before us. You're now Chief of National Intelligence in the Ministry of Defense. You had command responsibility for the CID and TID at that time. Can you elaborate for us specifically how you interacted with military intelligence? Can you tell us whether you or officers under your responsibility jointly interrogated persons deprived of liberty together with military officers or together with members of the TID, which were co-located there? Do you have any information about Vivunia Hospital? It's located nearby the Manic Farm. It was said to be a site from which people were involuntarily disappeared. What knowledge do you have of any persons from Vivunia Hospital who were interrogated by CID and TID units? Was there a registry kept, a database on this? Is it available? What knowledge did you also have of interrogations that took place? We were told that people were separated, male and female, and then interrogated, and that there was a huge proportion of sexual abuse, including rape and other forms of violence. Do you have any specific knowledge of that? Can you give us any information on the cases that were raised by NGOs regarding the events there? And also, the Reporters Without Borders have given us the names of at least 4 people who were allegedly abducted and interrogated by the TID with a claim of ill treatment and or torture. J.S. Tisinayagam, a journalist, the writer V. Jasikaran and his wife V. Valarnathi, and other names in their documentation. I'd welcome information on that. Now that leaves me very little time for the rest of my questions, but I think it's so important that we get to the straight story when we have somebody who's been in a position of authority at a key time associated with these reportedly horrific events. And I would welcome that. I'll spend my last 5 minutes on other questions, but I could go on. The Attorney General said that family visits are allowed to persons who are detained. Mr. Attorney General, were you referring to the CID, TID facilities, or were you referring to prison visits? And can you tell us in both places how often family members can visit, and do they have any privacy in such visits? We also received, I asked yesterday for information about 39 cases cited by the High Commissioner for Human Rights and acknowledged by the government to the Human Rights Committee in 2014, which reportedly involved sexual violence. And I'm wondering if, I didn't hear any information on this. Can you provide us with some further, an update on that, particularly information on investigations that took place, but also whether that, you actually gave us some information on investigations, but not on convictions or penalties. And I'd appreciate information on minimum penalties or sentences that were imposed for sexual violence. Also, we were given information here just to raise a subject that Madam Pradamala raised yesterday, domestic violence. We had some information from you that there's one shelter in the country, and we appreciate the information on the shelter. Can you tell us something about its capacity? And is it possible that there's only one in a country as populous as yours, where there are issues of that sort that abound? Also, I asked, and so did Mr. Bruni, about the judicial mechanism with the special counsel that's to be created. You wrote about it in your 2015 report. You've talked to the Human Rights Council about it. It's an issue that we have been raising. It seemed like from your responses that the action is going to be limited to only if it's recommended by the task force that's going to give its report next week or this week or something like that. Can you tell us anything about whether this will be a hybrid mechanism with the participation of international experts in addition to national officials? The prosecutor provided us some interesting information. Can you mandate an ex officio investigation on the basis of the information that the National Human Rights Council provides to investigators? And what investigators do they have to provide that information to? We both asked yesterday about witness protection. Out-of-court confessions, it seems like from the answers today that they can be introduced. In other words, that you're not going to eliminate this practice of having out-of-court confessions used as testimony, even if they were involuntary. Since the convention prohibits anything of that sort, do you have any data for us on the number of cases in the last 4 or 5 years in which a judge has rejected the use of a confession in a case under the Protection of Terrorism Act because it was found to be involuntary? Also, habeas corpus. We asked for data on that and the number of claims, how many, but I would appreciate if you could tell us how many have resulted in the release of a person from detention under the Protection of Terrorism Act, the PTA, or otherwise. Be great
2 more
if
minutes,
you could
Ms.
provide
Gale.
that. On the I appreciate the information that was provided. The aid workers case. The relatives claim that they were intimidated and threatened to give false testimony. Did you receive this information in such a way as to conduct an investigation into those claims? Did you find anything? And can you tell me how many members of the Army the CID has interviewed in this case? We understand that of the 9 that were detained, some have been released. Could you tell us how many have been released, how many are still detained? And the last witnesses seem to have been released last week. Can you tell us why or how you intend to proceed with this case? Is it finished? I seem to get that impression, and I was frankly, a bit shocked by that. I have about 30 seconds left, and so I just want to, Trinco 5 case, I got the impression that the problem is because a handful of people, of the 25 witnesses, a handful of them are abroad, that you can't interview them. Embassy testimony is not seen as safe by the witnesses. Many things are not seen as safe by the witnesses. Can't something be done more be done in order to bring them under some kind of scrutiny? I have a lot more questions, but...
Sorry, I did not have any answers to any of my questions. I asked how many cases of torture were identified by doctors when they examined in police custody. I asked whether the detainees have a right to call a doctor at their request. I asked how often magistrates and judges refer cases to judicial medical officers because of suspicion of torture. I asked whether the medical records in fact were available publicly, those that have been submitted to courts, and I asked whether it's true that there are no medical officers in prisons. I also asked about the National Human Rights Action Plan, the results of it, and what were the thoughts for 2017 and onwards, including if there were a deadline for making up with secret detention places, but I did not hear any of the replies here. At this point, we still have some 7 minutes left, and either we could have the rapporteurs coming back, or we could actually, in order to make sure that we have the answers from Mr. Mendes that Ms. Geyer asked for, that we actually give the time to the delegation. So actually, I think we have exhausted now our questions, and we would like the replies from the delegation. You can use a couple of minutes in recess, if you like, maybe 5 minutes to get organized, and then we resume. Fine. Thank you very much.
I would reiterate that the delegation would endeavor to provide a written representation to this committee within the 48 hours that is provided to submit such additional information. And on most of the issues that were raised yesterday as well as today, we will endeavor to get the most possible information and from widest possible areas and provide comprehensive answers to the areas where we can respond to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Attorney General. We thank you for the replies provided. We had hoped for more replies. We had hoped that there were not a lot of unanswered questions, particularly those relating to Mr. Mendes. Nevertheless, we hope that some of the replies will be kept within the written reply within the 48 hours, and we look very much forward to those replies.